One day, oceanographer Tom decides to take his family, his wife Julia and their two children Cassie and Ben, on a yacht trip through the Caribbean Sea. While Tom and Ben are busy fishing and Cassie is distracted with her electronic device, Julia jumps into the water to swim. Suddenly, something unsettles her. Julia looks around, but the sea remains as calm as ever. However, she feels a clear sense of danger, as if something large and threatening is lurking around her. At the same time, the yacht's instruments begin to behave strangely, but Tom, preoccupied with fishing, doesn't pay attention to them. Meanwhile, Julia feels increasingly worse and soon begins to drown. She screams desperately, but the family doesn't hear her. The water seems to move strangely, pulling her further away from the yacht. When the situation becomes critical, Tom finally hears her screams. He rushes to the helm and directs the yacht toward the distant Julia. Tom jumps into the water and, with the help of the children, they manage to pull her aboard and revive her. Tom is upset, as he always asks them to notify others before getting into the water. Julia apologizes, and the incident is quickly forgotten as the family has something to celebrate. It's Ben's 13th birthday. Tom lights the candles on the cake, and everyone congratulates Ben, who receives gifts while Cassie takes a family photo. At that moment, Cassie's boyfriend calls to ask her about the yacht trip, but suddenly, an intense storm begins to form in the background of the call. Cassie becomes worried, but her boyfriend reassures her, saying he's safe. The call cuts off. Cassie tells her parents about the storm on land, but just at that moment, everyone feels strange jolts and runs to the deck. What they see is terrifying. Enormous whale carcasses are emerging around the yacht. Tom explains that sometimes during storms, whales lose their way, but these animals are pushing the yacht and endangering their safety. Tom jumps into the water to investigate, but returns to the boat injured. While trying to understand what's happening, he cut himself on the motor's propeller. Julia stitches up the wound on his shoulder, while Tom tells her that the yacht's shafts seem to be bent, probably from a whale's tail strike. Now, it's unlikely that they'll be able to set sail. Later, Cassie tries to re-establish communication, but there's no signal, and the radio isn't picking up anything either. Tom starts calculating their supplies. They have enough water for about 4 days, no more. However, they were on a shipping route, so someone should find them soon. Suddenly, strange sounds begin to be heard from outside. When the family steps out onto the deck, they see bright objects falling from the sky, getting closer and closer. Taking a risk, Tom starts the yacht's engine and manages to steer it away from the next meteorite, but the engine finally breaks down. The next object falls so close that the family realizes they are Earth's artificial satellites. A strong wind begins to blow, and the instruments go haywire. The terrified family takes refuge inside the yacht, which is being tossed around by the waves. They put on life jackets and prepare for the worst when a strange sound, like a buzzing, is heard. The noise causes nosebleeds and nausea. Tom tries to call for help by firing a flare, but it's in vain. They barely survive the night. At dawn, the family breathes a sigh of relief seeing they are still alive, though they still don't know what awaits them on the horizon. The family is alive, but there's a huge hole in the side of the yacht, and it's unclear why it's still afloat. They step outside and are paralyzed with astonishment. The water has disappeared, and their boat is stranded on a rocky formation in the middle of a stony desert where the ocean once was. A while later, Tom tries to reassure his family, saying that not everyone could have perished. He takes some measurements and realizes the compass is failing. North isn't where it's supposed to be, which means the Earth's poles have shifted. Something like this has happened before on Earth, but a very long time ago. It turns out that the sea has retreated to where the land used to be, and most of humanity has likely perished. Cassie can't bear this revelation and runs to the cabin, asking to be left alone. Julia begins taking inventory of the remaining supplies, while Ben releases a bunch of colorful balloons into the sky, hoping someone will see them and come to their aid. Meanwhile, Tom turns on the radio and starts sending out distress signals. Surprisingly, he gets a response. It's from NATO, the captain of a small submarine. They were deeply submerged when the catastrophe happened, which is why they survived. However, all communication systems have failed, and expecting help is useless. According to his calculations, the sea will return in about a week, and it will be brutal. So NATO advises them to find higher ground and stay there. Julia orders the children to start packing their things. Tom, on the other hand, directly asks the captain if he can save their children. NATO explains that his submarine is very small and, unfortunately, his partner died, so he can only take one person. After much persuasion, Tom manages to convince NATO to take both children, providing him with their coordinates. Tom charts a course on the nautical map and promises to reach the location in a couple of days. The next morning, the family is almost ready to set off. Tom steps out onto the deck and suddenly sees a man with a dog approaching. He walks toward him and greets him, but notices that the man is injured. He offers him some water. The man drinks, but suddenly punches Tom in the face, something Julia sees from a distance. Julia runs to her husband just as the stranger stabs Tom in the chest with an improvised spear. The dog keeps Julia at bay, though she is frozen in terror herself, realizing there's no saving Tom. She runs toward the yacht, but the man chases her and injures her arm. Despite this, Julia manages to climb onto the boat, and the children, hearing her screams, run to help her. Together, they barricade the doors to the cabin. After that, Julia hides Cassie and Ben in a locker, giving her daughter the flare gun and instructing her to shoot only as a last resort. Meanwhile, the killer tries to break down the doors and eventually succeeds. Julia hides in the back bathroom, trying to patch up her wound. Upon entering, the intruder heads straight to the galley and grabs some food, showing that he is desperately hungry. Holding a can, the man starts searching the yacht. Julia arms herself with a kitchen knife while the intruder continues to search the boat. Finally, she jumps overboard and hides beneath the yacht. The killer peers through the hole in the hull but doesn't see her. However, the dog attacks Julia, forcing her to defend herself and kill it. The killer hears the yelp, comes outside, and finds the dog's body. Meanwhile, Julia climbs back onto the yacht through the porthole on the opposite side, but she falls straight into the killer's hands. He beats her, throws her onto a couch, and grabs her by the throat, clearly intending to strangle her. Cassie witnesses the entire scene and realizes this is the last resort. She opens the locker where she is hiding and shoots the man with the flare gun. The shot throws him to the side, but the flare starts a fire on the yacht. Julia orders the children to flee while she sneaks into the galley. The killer, only injured, tries to attack again. Julia kicks him away, grabs the already packed bags, and jumps overboard, where Ben finds his father's body. Cassie runs to the corpse and sobs over it. Julia kisses her deceased husband, but seeing the killer jump from the burning yacht, she takes the children and quickly flees. The yacht explodes behind them. The family runs through the stony desert and soon takes refuge in a rocky canyon where a stream flows. However, the water is salty and undrinkable. Cassie shares a small amount of water with her brother, but he refuses to drink. The boy feels guilty, believing the killer found them because he saw the balloons. Cassie also voices this thought, but Julia scolds her, defending her son and explaining that he didn't mean to cause any harm. She tells the children to prepare for the long journey ahead. At that moment, Julia sees the killer again, still relentlessly following them. The family runs. That afternoon, Ben finds the carcass of a hammerhead shark and tries to butcher it for food, but Julia sees the pursuer getting closer again and orders the children to run. They soon reach a field of toxic waste barrels that were once submerged. Julia urges them to keep moving, despite the threat of contamination, knowing the killer is still on their heels. The family walks across the former ocean floor, now dry, weaving through piles of plastic and other trash dumped by humans. Julia notices that Ben is severely dehydrated and gives him the last drops of water. Cassie has an emotional breakdown, convinced that they have no chance of survival, but Julia commands them to keep moving. Finally, they find the fuselage of a plane that crashed into the sea long ago and crawl inside to rest. Julia examines the last family photo and recounts to the children the story of her first meeting with Tom, which happened at her hospital when Tom was brought in with decompression sickness after a failed dive. The children weep, remembering their father and saying their final goodbyes to him. That night, Cassie is awakened by a noise and steps outside to sit near the plane. Out of the darkness, the killer approaches her, unaware that the girl is acting as bait. While he prepares to grab her, Julia ambushes him and stabs him with a knife. At dawn, the family prepares to continue their journey, only to discover that the killer's body has been devoured, a sign that something even more dangerous than humans lurks in the desert. They continue their march. Julia consults the map when suddenly Ben rushes ahead. His mother yells for him to stop, but the boy sprints toward a salty puddle and manages to drink a few sips before Julia pulls him away. The boy becomes sick shortly after. Soon, they find some plastic chairs and build an improvised shelter to protect themselves from the relentless sun. While resting inside the improvised shelter, Julia hears strange sounds. She steps outside and sees something that forces her to wake the children immediately. Realizing the new danger, they start running. Soon, they spot a large ship in the distance, surrounded by destroyed containers and a few people wandering around. Julia calls out to them, but upon seeing thousands of giant crabs, the people dash into a container and lock the doors, ignoring her pleas for help. The three of them climb onto a container, though the crabs manage to wound Julia in the leg. Despite this, Julia, Cassie, and Ben sit on top, watching as the crabs break through a crack in the doors and kill everyone inside. Despite the desperate attempts of the people to fend them off, Julia ties a scarf around her leg and passes out. The next morning, Julia wakes up alone, terrified, and calls for the children. It turns out the crabs have moved on, and the children had gone down to search for food and weapons. Julia cauterizes her wound, while Ben examines the weapons they found. Searching through the containers, they find a small amount of food and water in the pocket of one of the deceased. Julia finds a radio and contacts Nato, who explains that he was also attacked by deep-sea arthropods. Based on his observations, the sea will return soon, which is why the creatures have emerged. Julia begs him to save her children, but she's unsure where to go because she has lost the map. Nato fires a flare, and Ben sees the direction. The family rushes toward it. Soon, they see a yellow submarine in the distance, but reaching it is difficult due to the terrain of the former seabed. Cassie disagrees with her mother's insistence on talking about saving only the children, but Julia refuses to explain and pushes the family onward. They are forced to pass through a canyon contaminated with toxic waste. At one point, they are caught in a rock slide, and Julia becomes separated from the children. She orders them to continue, and when Cassie refuses, Julia pleads with her to save her brother. Cassie and Ben make it out of the canyon and reach the submarine, but inside, they find no one. Suddenly, Nato, gravely wounded, emerges from behind the submarine. He admits that he has no chance of surviving and orders them to climb aboard. However, Cassie goes back for her mother, who is fending off the emerging crabs, with her bullets nearly depleted. Cassie climbs the rocky barrier and extends her hand to her mother. They manage to reach the submarine just as the crabs overrun Nato, who dies under their claws. The family climbs aboard, and at that moment, a giant wave appears on the horizon. The water lifts the submarine and drags it across the rocks. As Julia watches, everything that has happened over the past few days flashes before her eyes. She eventually faints. Upon waking, the submarine is at a standstill. Julia opens the hatch, and the family emerges to find themselves in a ruined city, carried there by the wave.